Well, hey everybody, let me start by saying that if you are watching this, we're sorry, because that means that the internet connection did not hold out for you to participate in our night of worship. But because we really wanted you to be able to be a part, we took some time to go ahead and pre-record this so that you could still share in the messages of the cross that are going to be a central part of what we're doing for Good Friday. When we think about Good Friday, obviously we think about the cross, because Good Friday is the time that we set aside to remember what Jesus did for us on the cross. And really the cross is central to all that we do, all that we believe as followers of Jesus. The cross is a dividing point in human history. But when you look at the cross, one thing that you notice is that the cross in itself is full of paradoxes. What do we mean? We mean things that are true about the cross that seem like they both can't be true of the same thing. Things that may conflict with each other, but yet they are both true. For instance, the cross is a sign of humiliating defeat. It's where criminals went to be executed for their crimes. They were stripped naked, beaten, mocked, and hung in public for all to see. It was a sign of humiliating defeat, and yet God used it to bring about eternal victory for His Son. You look at the cross and you see ugliness and brutality. But when we see the cross now, we think of the sacred beauty that is there. When you look at the cross, it was an instrument of death. Matter of fact, it was not until after everyone who had seen a real Roman crucifixion had died that the cross became a piece of jewelry. Before that, it absolutely was not, because the cross was a symbol of death. But now for those of us who know Jesus, it has become a symbol of life. The cross in itself is full of mystery. But I think it almost had to be that way because God used the cross to answer the greatest mystery that any of us will ever face. And that mystery is this question: how can we be made right with God? How can you, how can I, how can any of us be made right from God? Now, at first glance, maybe to you that does not seem like a very difficult question. Maybe it seems pretty simple on its face, but I think the more we understand about God and the more we understand about ourselves, the more difficult and complicated that question becomes. So let's just start here. Let's start with something we can all agree on. I think we can all agree on this, at least I hope we can. None of us are perfect. Not you, not me, not your kids, not my kids, not anybody. None of us are perfect. And you may say, well, of course we agree with that. That's not a big deal. It is a big deal when we understand that God is. God is perfect. You and I, not a human on earth, we're not perfect. God is perfect. And it's even more troublesome when we begin to understand that our imperfection, our sin, is what separates us from God in the first place. The question, how are we made right with God, presupposes that we're not right with God, that we are separated. And it is our imperfection, our sin, that separates us from God. And sin is simply this: sin is the wrong things in life that we do and the good things in life we leave undone. And the Bible is very clear that all of us have fallen short of God's perfect standard. Now, the easy answer then is, well, if we're imperfect and that separates us from God, if our sin has created this separation, then aren't we made right with God by God just looking at us and saying, no big deal, I forgive you? I mean, it seems simple, right? But here's the problem. If God were to just forgive us, then He would cease to be perfect. That's because He would, like many of us are so often guilty of ourselves, just ignoring the real problem. See, if God were just to blink at our sin and give us a little slap on the wrist, then He ceases to be perfect. He ignores the real problem. What do I mean by that? Here's what I mean. If you're sick and you go to the doctor for help, you want that doctor to do more than just treat the symptoms that you walk in with. You want them to find the problem and to cure it. In the same way, it would be malpractice for the God of eternity to just treat the symptoms of your problem and never cure you, never heal you for the inside out. God can't just forgive us because it's simple. Beyond that, None of us, not a one, would even want a God who treated sin that way. None of us would want a God who lets sin go unchecked. I would submit that every single one of us wants a God who will punish evil and cruelty. Every one of us wants there to be a God that holds people accountable for their actions. I think there's something within us that cries out for justice, that cries out for fairness. When we look at the world, we say that's not fair. That's a problem for us because something within us cries out and says that's wrong. And I think the only thing that really satisfies that place in our heart is that we know that one day every single man, woman, and child will have to stand before God and give an account for all the things that they've done in their life. Every one of us wants a God who'll punish sin. Who wants to worship a God who lets Hitler get off with a slap on the wrist? We want a just God. We want a righteous God. We want a God who will make wrongs right. But then we run into another problem. We want a God to deal with the wickedness of other people, but what about our own? We've already admitted that we're not perfect, so how should God deal with what we've done wrong? And see, you start to see this is not a simple question. This is a mystery. This is a problem. Because every one of us wants God to hold others accountable for their sin, but how's He supposed to treat our sin? What's He to do with our problems? So now, we don't just want a just God. We don't just want a righteous God. We want a loving God. Now we want a God who will look at us and understand that we aren't perfect. We want a God who will look at us and see us in our weakness, understand us in our brokenness, and still love us. Now we don't just want a God of justice. Now we want a God of mercy and a God of grace. So the question is, which is it? Do we want a God who will set evil right, who will hold the wicked accountable, who lets no evil deed go unpunished? Or do we want a God who is loving and kind and forgiving? Do we want a righteous God or do we want a merciful God? You see, right there, that's the mystery of the cross. Because in the cross of Jesus Christ, God was both at the same time just and loving. He was righteous and He was merciful. Paul puts it this way in Romans 3:21 through 26. Paul says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. None of us are perfect. Yet they are justified freely by His grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus." So there it is. We've all fallen short, and yet we've all been justified freely. God presented Him, Jesus, as an atoning sacrifice in His blood, received through faith to demonstrate His righteousness, because in His restraint, God passed over the sins previously committed. God presented Jesus, to demonstrate His righteousness at the present time, and here's our phrase, so that He would be righteous and declare righteous the one who has faith in Jesus. Man, that's amazing. We are all sinners who fall far short of the perfection that a holy and just God demands. And yet, we are justified. We are declared right with God. How? How is that possible? It's because in the death of Jesus on the cross, God demonstrated His own righteousness and He made it possible for us to become righteous. God demonstrated His righteousness and His justice by pouring out the full measure of His wrath against sin on the cross. But God shows His love in that He poured it out on Jesus and not us. God is both just and justifier. In the cross, He declares His righteousness and His justice. And in the cross, He shows us His love and His mercy. He is just in that He punishes sin. He's loving in that He took that punishment in Himself. And that mystery of the cross is how you and I can be made right with God. When we come to the place that we acknowledge our imperfection and cry out to Him for forgiveness, you and I can be made right. He is righteous, and through Jesus, He declares righteous. And that is the mystery of the cross that we can try to understand, that we stand in awe of, but honestly, we're probably never going to get our brains around it. I know I haven't, but that's what makes His grace so amazing, and that's what makes Friday so good.